my wife declared. I need to spend time with my ex or the marriage is off. I replied calmly, okay, do it. Then I immediately set up 3 dates with her friends and flaunted my newfound freedom. She was shocked and begged to call the whole thing off. So there I was, sitting across from my wife Riley at our dining table on what I thought was going to be just another Tuesday night. You know how some moments feel like they're happening in slow motion? This wasn't one of those. This was more like getting hit by a freight train while you're checking your phone for the weather. Riley was doing that thing she does when she's nervous, twisting her wedding band around her finger like it's some kind of stress ball, or maybe a magic lamp she could rub to make uncomfortable conversations disappear. The apartment was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic from downtown and the occasional honk of some impatient driver who probably had their own relationship drama to deal with. Our dinner plates were still sitting there, half-eaten pasta getting cold, because apparently we were about to have one of those conversations that makes food taste like cardboard anyway. Riley cleared her throat, and I could tell she'd been rehearsing whatever she was about to say. You know that look people get when they've practiced something in the mirror? Yeah, that was her face right then. She straightened up, looked me dead in the eyes, and said, very steady and deliberate, I need to spend time with my ex, or the marriage is off. Just like that. 6 words that felt like a small explosion in our quiet little world. Not, I've been thinking about, or what would you say if, or even, I know this sounds crazy, but, nope. Straight to the nuclear option like she was ordering coffee. I need to spend time with my ex, or the marriage is off. Period. End of discussion. Except it wasn't the end, was it? It was just the beginning of whatever the hell this was supposed to be. I sat there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only about 10 seconds, just processing what I'd heard. You know when you're watching a movie and something so ridiculous happens that you actually laugh out loud? That was the feeling bubbling up in my chest. Except this wasn't Netflix, and there wasn't going to be a happy ending in 90 minutes with credits rolling over some feel-good pop song. The thing is, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam my fist on the table or throw my napkin down like some dramatic soap opera character. I didn't even ask why, which probably threw her off more than anything else I could have done. I just looked at her, this woman I'd been sharing a bed and a Netflix password with for the past 3 years, and said, okay, do it. You should have seen her face. Her mouth opened just a little, like a door caught in the wind, and I could practically see the gears grinding in her head. This wasn't how this was supposed to go down in whatever script she'd been writing in her mind. She expected me to beg, to fight, to throw myself at her feet and promise to be a better husband if she'd just reconsider. She wanted me to bargain, maybe offer couples therapy or a vacation to Cabo or whatever it is that desperate husbands throw at their wives when they're watching their marriages circle the drain. But here's the thing about ultimatums. They're not really negotiations, are they? They're power plays disguised as choices. When someone gives you an ultimatum, they're basically saying, dance for me, monkey, or I'm taking my ball and going home. And I've never been much of a dancer, so instead of giving her the dramatic reaction she was fishing for, I just pushed my chair back from the table and walked to the balcony. Our apartment's got this decent view of the city, nothing fancy, but you can see the lights stretching out toward the horizon like fallen stars. It's the kind of view that makes you feel small in a good way, like your problems are just tiny blips in this massive, chaotic, beautiful mess of humanity, all trying to figure their shit out, that I pulled out my phone and sent a text to my best friend Kaido. The guy's got this Zen thing going on that usually annoys me, but right then I needed someone who wouldn't immediately start screaming about lawyers and revenge and all that toxic masculinity bullshit that people think is helpful in situations like this. I kept it simple. She gave an ultimatum. I accepted calmly. Kaido's response came back faster than I expected. Then keep your center. No drama. Only boundaries. See, this is why I like the guy. No 20 questions, no demands for details, no immediate advice about how I should handle my obviously crazy wife. Just keep your center. Like I'm some kind of martial arts master instead of a 32-year-old guy who can barely keep his houseplants alive. I stayed out on that balcony for maybe 20 minutes, just breathing and watching the city do its thing. Cars moving like blood cells through arteries. People in lit windows living their own little dramas, probably some of them having their own spend time with my ex or else conversations. It's funny how when your world's falling apart, everything else just keeps moving like nothing happened. When I finally went back inside, Riley was still sitting at the table, but now she had that look people get when they've just realized they might have miscalculated. You know, that expression that's half confusion and half panic. Like when you're playing chess and you suddenly notice your opponent's been setting up a trap for the last 5 moves. So that's it, she said, and I could hear the slight tremor in her voice. You're just going to let me go see him? You didn't ask permission, I said, sitting back down and picking up my fork like we were still having a normal dinner conversation. You gave me a choice between your ex and divorce. I chose your ex. Congratulations, you got what you wanted. The silence that followed was the kind that feels heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. I could practically hear her brain working overtime, trying to figure out what had just happened and why it wasn't going according to whatever plan she'd cooked up. Maybe she thought I'd fight harder for us. Maybe she thought I cared more. Or maybe she just thought I was a bigger pushover than I actually turned out to be. But here's what I was thinking while I twirled pasta around my fork and pretended everything was totally normal. If my wife needed to threaten our marriage to spend time with another man, then maybe our marriage wasn't worth saving anyway. And if she was willing to blow up 3 years together for some nostalgic bullshit with her ex, then maybe I'd been married to someone I never really knew in the first place. The rest of dinner passed in that awkward kind of quiet where both people are pretending to eat while actually just moving food around their plates. Riley kept stealing glances at me like she was waiting for me to crack, to show some emotion, to give her something she could work with. But I was done dancing to her tune. That night, lying in bed next to someone who'd just threatened to leave me, I stared at the ceiling and felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not heartbreak, not anger, not even disappointment. Just this weird, calm sense of clarity, like I'd finally stopped trying to solve a puzzle that was missing half its pieces. Tomorrow would bring conversations about ground rules and boundaries and all the practical bullshit that comes with your spouse wanting to play house with someone else. But tonight, I was just going to lie here and listen to the city outside our window and think about what it means to have a center worth keeping. The next morning came with that awkward energy you get when someone's dropped a bomb in your living room, and now you're both tiptoeing around the crater pretending everything's totally fine. Riley was already up when I rolled out of bed, standing in the kitchen making coffee like she was performing some kind of domestic theater. You know that thing people do when they're trying really hard to act normal? Yeah, that was her whole vibe. Aggressively casual, like if she made the coffee just right, maybe last night's conversation would magically disappear and I shuffled into the kitchen in my boxers and that old Knicks t-shirt that's got more holes than fabric, and she turned around with this bright, fake smile that probably looked better in her head. "Morning, babe," she said, like she hadn't just threatened to torpedo our marriage 12 hours earlier. "I made your coffee the way you like it. The way I like it. Right. Because nothing says, I might leave you for my ex, like remembering how many sugars go in your husband's morning caffeine fix." I took the mug anyway, because I'm not an animal, and waited for whatever fresh hell she was about to serve up alongside my breakfast. "So," she said, settling down at the table with her own cup and that purposeful look people get when they're about to pitch you something you definitely don't want to buy. "I've been thinking about how this could work. You know, if we're going to do this thing. This thing." Like she was talking about trying a new restaurant or maybe switching cable providers. Not, you know, spending quality time with the guy she used to sleep with before she met me. But sure, let's call it this thing and pretend we're all mature adults here. "I figured we should have some ground rules," she continued, pulling out her phone like she'd actually made a list. Because of course she had. Riley's the type who makes lists for everything. Groceries, vacation packing, apparently the terms and conditions of her extramarital nostalgia tour. You know, to keep things healthy and transparent. Healthy and transparent. I almost choked on my coffee, but I just nodded and waited for her to lay out whatever rulebook she'd cooked up in her head while I was sleeping. "Okay, so first, honesty if asked. Like, if you ask me something direct about what I did or where I went, I'll tell you the truth. No lies, no hiding anything." She looked up at me like she expected a gold star for promising not to lie to her own husband. "Second, be safe. Obviously. Like, common sense stuff. And third, no sleepovers. I'll always come home. And fourth, don't embarrass me. Like, don't go posting weird stuff on social media or telling everyone we know about our business." I sat there for a minute, just letting her words settle in the space between us. Ground rules. For my wife to hang out with her ex-boyfriend. Rules that she'd apparently spent considerable time thinking about, which meant this whole thing wasn't some spur-of-the-moment breakdown. This was planned, calculated. She'd been thinking about this for a while. Sounds reasonable, I said, and watched her face brighten like I'd just agreed to let her keep a puppy. Same applies to you, though. And there it was, that flicker in her eyes, like someone had just told her there was a quiz she hadn't studied for. The little pause where her brain had to catch up with what I'd just said. Because here's the thing about people who give ultimatums. They never expect you to flip the script on them. What do you mean? Same applies to me, she asked, and I could hear that note of uncertainty creeping into her voice. Well, if you get to revisit the past with your ex, I said, taking another sip of my coffee like we were discussing the weather, then I guess I get to explore some new present opportunities. With your friends. The silence that followed was the kind you could cut with a knife. Riley just stared at me like I'd started speaking Mandarin or maybe suggested we sacrifice a goat in the living room. This clearly wasn't part of her master plan. See, over the years, Riley had made sure to tell me exactly which of her friends had made comments about me. It wasn't malicious or anything. Just one of those things that happens when you're married and your spouse shares their social circle's observations. There was Amara, her college friend who'd always been warm and funny and had once mentioned that I seemed genuinely kind, which is rare. Tessa, her ambitious work friend who'd said I was actually intelligent, not just guy thinks he's intelligent. And Noor, her blunt childhood friend who'd flat out told Riley that I was too good for her, after some argument we'd had about whose turn it was to clean the bathroom. I'd filed away these comments like sticky notes in my brain, not because I was planning anything, but because that's what you do when people say nice things about you. You remember them for the days when you're feeling like garbage about yourself. But now, sitting across from my wife who wanted permission to go play footsie with her ex, those mental sticky notes suddenly seemed relevant. You're serious? Riley said, and I could see her trying to figure out if I was bluffing. Dead serious. If the rules work for you, they work for me. Honesty if asked. Be safe. No sleepovers. Don't embarrass you. Fair's fair, right? I pulled out my own phone and started typing. 3 messages, each one polite and straightforward. To Amara. Hey, this might sound weird, but would you be interested in getting drinks Friday? Just as friends, Riley and I are working through some stuff, and I could use a friendly conversation. To Tessa. I know this is random, but would you want to grab dinner Saturday? No agenda, just thought it might be nice to talk to someone outside my usual circle. And to Noor, Coffee Tuesday? I have a feeling you might have some thoughts about the current state of my marriage. I hit send on all 3 before I could second-guess myself, then set my phone down and looked at Riley, who was staring at me like I'd just grown a second head. You can't be serious, she said, but her voice had gone up an octave, which meant she absolutely knew I was serious. Amara texted back first. Oh wow, yeah, okay. Everything all right. Cedar and glass at 7 work for you. Then Tessa. That does sound random, but sure. I know a place. Are you and Riley okay? And finally, Noor called. Actually called, which if you know Noor, means she had thoughts with a capital T. You're serious? She said when I picked up. She actually said that? She gave you an ultimatum about her ex? Fine, Coffee Tuesday. But I'm bringing honesty, and you might not like what I have to say. I hung up and looked at Riley, who had gone from confused to worried to something that looked suspiciously like panic. 3 for 3, I said. Funny how that works out. This is not what I meant, she said, and there was an edge to her voice now, like someone who'd just realized their clever plan had a massive loophole they hadn't considered. What did you mean? I asked, genuinely curious. Because from where I'm sitting, you wanted the freedom to explore connections outside our marriage. I'm just asking for the same courtesy. The thing is, I wasn't doing this to hurt her or get revenge or any of that petty bullshit. I was doing it because if my marriage was going to survive whatever midlife crisis or existential breakdown or nostalgic bullshit Riley was going through, it was going to survive as equals. Not as her getting special privileges while I sat at home like a good little husband, waiting for her to get this out of her system. Riley spent the rest of the morning in what I can only describe as a psychological tailspin, alternating between defensive justifications and wounded silence. She kept looking at me like she was trying to solve a puzzle, and I could practically see her brain working overtime to figure out how this had gotten so far out of her control so fast. But here's what she didn't understand, and what I was just starting to figure out myself. Respect without reciprocity isn't love. It's just well-dressed doormat behavior. And I was done being anyone's doormat, even my wife's. Friday rolled around faster than I expected, which is always how it goes when you're doing something that might blow up in your face. I spent the whole day at work trying to focus on quarterly reports and budget projections, but my brain kept drifting to this weird new reality where I was about to have drinks with my wife's friend, while said wife was probably somewhere across town rekindling whatever flame she thought she'd left burning with her ex-modern marriage. Folks, it's a real trip that I left the office around 6, which gave me just enough time to swing by my apartment and change out of my corporate monkey suit into something that said, I'm a normal human being having a normal conversation, instead of, I'm having a nervous breakdown disguised as a social experiment. Jeans, button-down shirt, the leather jacket Riley bought me for my birthday last year because she said it made me look less like an accountant and more like someone who might own a motorcycle. The irony wasn't lost on me. Cedar and Glass turned out to be one of those trendy spots that tries really hard to look like it wasn't trying hard. Exposed brick, industrial lighting. The kind of place where they serve cocktails in mason jars and charge $15 for what's essentially fancy lemonade. It was exactly the sort of bar Amara would pick, and I spotted her right away at a high-top table near the window, wearing this teal dress that made her look like she'd stepped out of a magazine spread about effortless weekend style. Jules, the bartender, was this 20-something with sleeve tattoos and the kind of customer service smile that probably earned her excellent tips. She slid 2 mocktails toward us without being asked. Apparently, Amara had already ordered for both of us, which saved me from having to decode whatever hipster cocktail menu they were working with. So, Amara said after we'd done the obligatory small talk about traffic and weather and how surprisingly good the mocktails were, this is either the most mature thing ever, or we're all about to star in our own personal soap opera. I laughed, because honestly, what else do you do? Yeah, I'm still figuring out which one it is myself. Amara's got this easy laugh that probably made her popular in college and definitely makes her good at her job in marketing. It's the kind of laugh that makes you want to say funnier things just to hear it again. We talked about safe stuff first, her new apartment in Brooklyn that she loves except for the neighbor who apparently practices interpretive dance at 3 in the morning, my newfound obsession with running that started as stress relief and turned into actual enjoyment, the completely fucked state of the subway system that we all just accept like it's some kind of natural disaster we have to live with. But eventually, because we're both adults and not idiots, we got to the real reason we were sitting across from each other in a trendy bar on a Friday night, while our mutual friend was off doing God knows what with her ex-boyfriend. So Riley wants permission for nostalgia, Amara said, swirling her drink thoughtfully. But nostalgia's a poor guide, you know? It's like looking at your high school yearbook and thinking you were cooler than you actually were. The thing about Amara is that she's got this way of cutting straight to the heart of things without making it feel like surgery. She's not trying to fix anything or take sides or give advice you didn't ask for. She's just observing, like a really perceptive scientist studying human behavior in its natural habitat. I think she's scared, I said, which surprised me because I hadn't really articulated that thought before. Not of losing me, exactly, but of, I don't know, being ordinary? Like maybe if she can prove she's still the kind of person her ex wanted, then she's still interesting. And what about you? Amara asked. What are you scared of? Honestly, I'm scared I've been married to someone I don't actually know. Like maybe the person I fell in love with was just really good at pretending to be someone else. We sat with that for a minute, watching the Friday night crowd flow around us. Couples on dates, friends celebrating the end of another work week, people trying to wash away whatever disappointments they'd collected over the past 5 days. It struck me that most of these people probably had their own versions of the same problems, just dressed up differently. You know what's funny? Amara said, Riley used to complain that you were too stable. Like, she'd say it wasn't a bad thing, but she'd mention how you never surprised her anymore. And I always thought, what kind of person complains about stability? Do you know how many people would kill for a partner who shows up consistently? This was news to me, and I filed it away in the growing folder of things my wife apparently discussed with everyone except me. But it also made a weird kind of sense. Maybe this whole thing wasn't about her ex at all. Maybe it was about her needing to feel like she was still the kind of person who could make impulsive, dramatic choices instead of someone who'd settled into a comfortable life with a comfortable husband. So what happens now? I asked. Now you finish your overpriced mocktail. I finish mine, and we figure out if we actually like talking to each other or if this was just relationship trauma bonding. As it turned out, we did like talking to each other. Amara's got this sharp sense of humor and this way of seeing patterns in people's behavior that made the conversation feel less like a weird social experiment and more like hanging out with someone I should have gotten to know years ago. We talked about books. She's into those psychological thrillers where everyone's secretly terrible, while I prefer science fiction where at least the terrible people are fighting aliens. We discussed travel, specifically how everyone claims they want to backpack through Europe, but really they just want to post Instagram photos from places with good lighting. There was no kiss, no hand-holding, no moment where we gazed into each other's eyes and realized we were meant to be together. Just two people having an honest conversation about messy human relationships while consuming artisanal beverages. When the night wound down, we hugged goodbye like normal adults, and I walked to the subway with this message playing in my head. I can be kind and still have a spine. The train ride home gave me time to think about what had just happened. Not the surface-level stuff, having drinks with my wife's friend while she was out with her ex, but the deeper realization that I'd just spent 3 hours being myself without having to manage someone else's emotions or walk on eggshells around someone else's insecurities. When was the last time I'd done that with Riley? When I got home, Riley was waiting in the living room like a judge in a quiet courtroom, still in the dress she'd worn for her own evening out. She looked up when I walked in, and I could see her scanning my face for evidence of whatever she thought might have happened. "Did you sleep with her?" she asked, straight up, no preamble. "We agreed on boundaries," I said, hanging my jacket on the chair. "It was drinks and conversation. That's all." The air in the room turned colder than our refrigerator, and I realized that my calm, honest answer was somehow more threatening to her than if I'd come home with lipstick on my collar and a guilty expression. Because if I could go out, have a good time, and stick to the rules we'd both agreed on, then what excuse did she have for whatever line she might be tempted to cross? I went to bed that night thinking about stability and surprises, about the difference between being boring and being reliable, and about whether the person lying next to me actually wanted a husband or just wanted someone to react dramatically to whatever chaos she decided to create. But mostly, I thought about how good it felt to have a conversation where I didn't have to be anyone other than exactly who I am. Saturday morning hit me like a hangover, except instead of too much tequila, I was dealing with the aftermath of my wife's social circle losing their collective shit over my Friday night beverage consumption with Amara. I woke up to my phone buzzing like an angry wasp, and before I'd even had my first cup of coffee, I was fielding calls from people who apparently had very strong opinions about my life choices. The first salvo came from Jordan, Riley's brother, who called at exactly 9:30 a.m. because he's the type of guy who thinks being up early gives him some kind of moral authority. Jordan's always been one of those dudes who peaked in high school and never quite figured out that the rest of us moved on from caring about who was dating whom and why. He's got this voice that sounds like he's perpetually disappointed in everyone around him, which I guess makes sense when you're 33 and still living in your mom's basement while figuring things out. "Yo, what the hell, man?" he said, skipping right past any normal greeting. "Riley told me you're dating her friends now? That's some cold shit, even for you. Even for me. Like I had a reputation for being some kind of heartless bastard instead of the guy who'd been quietly putting up with his sister's emotional tornado for the past 3 years. I was standing in my kitchen in boxers and a t-shirt that said, "World's okayest husband," a gag gift from Riley that felt increasingly prophetic, trying to make sense of this conversation before my brain was fully online. "I'm not dating anyone," I said, measuring coffee grounds with the precision of someone who really needed caffeine to function. Riley gave me an ultimatum about seeing her ex. I accepted it and asked for the same courtesy she was giving herself. "Fair's fair. Fair's fair." Jordan's voice went up about 3 octaves, like I'd just suggested we sacrifice his firstborn child. "Dude, she's going through something. You're supposed to be supportive, not whatever this is." "What exactly is this, Jordan?" I asked, genuinely curious about how he was going to spin my having a completely innocent conversation over mocktails into some kind of betrayal. Because from where I'm standing, I had drinks with a friend and went home alone. Riley did. What exactly last night? There was this pause where I could practically hear his brain short-circuiting, because apparently nobody had bothered to ask Riley for details about her own evening, which told me everything I needed to know about how this whole situation was being framed in the family group chat. "You're making it worse," he muttered, falling back on that classic move where people blame you for not handling their bad behavior gracefully enough. "I'm making it even," I replied, and hung up before he could launch into whatever lecture he'd prepared about how real men handle relationship problems. But Jordan was just the opening act. My mom called 20 minutes later, and I could tell from her voice that she'd been thinking about this all night. Aisha's got this way of cutting through bullshit that probably comes from raising 3 kids as a single parent after my dad decided that responsibility wasn't really his thing. She doesn't waste time on drama, but she also doesn't let you get away with being stupid. "Son," she said, and I could picture her sitting in her kitchen with her own coffee, probably already dressed and ready for whatever Saturday had in store. "I heard about what's happening with you and Riley." "Did you now?" I said, because in my family, news travels faster than gossip in a small town. "And what exactly did you hear?" "I heard that girl gave you some kind of ultimatum, and instead of fighting for your marriage, you're out here playing games with her friends." I sat down at my kitchen table, because this was clearly going to be one of those conversations that required my full attention. "Mom, I'm not playing games. Riley told me she needed to spend time with her ex, or she was ending our marriage." I said okay. Then I asked for the same freedom she was giving herself. "How is that playing games?" There was another one of those pauses that mothers are famous for, the kind where you know they're choosing their words carefully because they love you, but they also think you might be making a mistake. "Baby, I'm not saying you're wrong," she said finally. "But don't trade anger for dignity. Keep your dignity. And see, this is why I love my mom. She wasn't taking sides or telling me what to do. She was just reminding me who I am and who I want to be, regardless of what chaos is swirling around me." After we hung up, I sat there for a while thinking about the difference between dignity and doormat behavior, and whether it was possible to maintain both your self-respect and your marriage when your spouse was actively testing the boundaries of both. The third hit came via text from Bianca, our wedding planner, who was apparently living in some parallel universe where Riley and I were still happily planning our upcoming nuptials instead of conducting some kind of social experiment about the limits of marital flexibility. Her message was all business. "Hi, just checking in about the menu tasting next week and the final headcount for the venue. Also, the florist needs the deposit by Monday or we'll lose the date. Let me know what works." I stared at that text for a solid 5 minutes, just trying to process the surreal nature of discussing flower deposits while my wife was off exploring whether the grass was greener with her ex-boyfriend. It was like getting a cheerful reminder about your dentist appointment while your house was actively burning down around you. But here's what hit me while I was looking at Bianca's perfectly professional message about our perfectly planned wedding. You can cancel contracts, but you can't cancel character. All these vendors and venues and carefully coordinated details could be undone with a few phone calls and some financial penalties. But the person you choose to be when everything goes sideways? That's the only thing that actually matters when the dust settles. Riley spent most of Saturday in what I can only describe as a feedback loop of emotional processing. She'd be defensive for an hour, explaining why her situation was completely different from mine and how I was being unfair by applying the same rules to both of us. Then she'd go quiet for a while, usually while scrolling through photos on her phone, old vacation pictures, I assumed, or maybe text conversations with her ex that she was analyzing for hidden meaning. Then she'd cycle back to defensive, like she was trying to talk herself into believing her own justifications. Around 3 in the afternoon, I found her on the couch with her laptop open, scrolling through what looked like old social media posts. She had that expression people get when they're trying to recreate a feeling they remember having but can't quite access anymore, like someone desperately trying to remember the lyrics to a song that made them happy in high school. "Find anything interesting?" I asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Just memories," she said, not looking up from the screen. "Remember when everything felt simpler? I remember when we didn't have to negotiate the terms and conditions of our marriage like it was a business contract," I said, which probably came out harsher than I intended. But honestly, I was getting tired of pretending this was all totally normal. She looked up at me then, and for a second I saw something that looked like the person I'd fallen in love with. Uncertain, a little scared, Maybe finally starting to realize that actions have consequences even when you really, really don't want them to. I didn't think you'd actually do it, she said quietly. Go out with Amara, I mean. And I didn't think you'd actually give me an ultimatum about spending time with your ex, I replied. But here we are. That night, I made dinner for one and ate it slowly, thinking about how marriage was supposed to be about building something together, not about one person constantly testing whether the foundation could handle whatever new weight they decided to throw on it. I thought about dignity and character and whether it was possible to love someone who seemed determined to see how much damage they could do before you finally broke. But mostly, I thought about how quiet the apartment felt when nobody was trying to justify the unjustifiable. Saturday evening found me standing outside Bella Vista, this cozy Italian joint that Tessa had picked, trying to shake off the weird energy from Jordan's morning guilt trip and my mom's well-intentioned reality check. The place had that authentic neighborhood vibe, not the kind of Italian restaurant that tries too hard with fake Tuscan murals and Dean Martin playing on repeat, but the sort where the owner's grandmother probably still makes the sauce and argues with customers about whether they're ordering enough food. Plants hung from every available surface like the place was trying to become a greenhouse, and the lighting was warm enough to make everyone look like they were having a better time than they probably were. I spotted Tessa right away at a corner table, looking like she'd stepped out of a boardroom and into date night without missing a beat. She had on this black blazer that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, but she wore it like armor instead of fashion. The kind of outfit that said, I'm here to conduct business, even if that business happens to be personal. When I walked over, she looked up from her phone with those sharp eyes that had probably made more than one corporate executive reconsider their quarterly projections. Tessa's got this way of looking at people like she's reading their annual report and deciding whether they're worth investing in. It should be intimidating, but somehow it just made me feel like I was finally dealing with someone who wasn't going to waste my time with bullshit. So, she said before I'd even fully settled into my chair, I'm not a prop for anybody's power game. If we're here, it's to talk like adults, not because you're trying to make Riley jealous or because she put you up to something weird. We clear on that? I respected the hell out of that opening move. No small talk. No pretending this wasn't exactly as strange as it obviously was. Just straight-up boundaries delivered with the efficiency of someone who'd clearly thought this through. We're clear, I said. I'm here because I wanted to have dinner with someone who might actually tell me the truth about what's happening instead of trying to manage my feelings about it. Good, she said, signaling the waiter with the kind of subtle hand gesture that said she'd definitely handled her share of business dinners. Because Riley already called me today, trying to get me to cancel. Of course she had. Because apparently my wife's strategy for dealing with the consequences of her ultimatum was to try to control every variable except her own behavior. I ordered the osso buco because life's too short for safe menu choices, and Tessa went with some kind of seafood pasta that probably had a name I couldn't pronounce without embarrassing myself. What did she say? I asked, genuinely curious about how this situation was being spun in Riley's version of events. She told me you were punishing her, Tessa said, taking a sip of the wine she'd ordered without consulting me, a power move I could appreciate. Said you were trying to hurt her by involving her friends. I told her that an ultimatum is a choice with teeth, and if she didn't want people to bite back, maybe she shouldn't have started chomping. That actually made me laugh, which felt weird given the circumstances, but there was something liberating about talking to someone who wasn't trying to protect my feelings or convince me that up was down and black was white. Tessa had this way of cutting through emotional fog with pure logic, like a really expensive knife through overcooked steak. You know what's funny? She continued, twirling pasta around her fork with the same precision she probably brought to contract negotiations. Riley's been complaining about feeling trapped in routine for months. Says you two never do anything spontaneous anymore. That marriage made everything predictable. But when you do something unexpected, suddenly you're the bad guy. This was becoming a theme. Apparently, my wife had been conducting a whole secondary conversation about our relationship with everyone except me. I was starting to feel like the last person to know that my own marriage was in trouble, which is either really sad or really pathetic, depending on how you want to look at it. So what's your take? I asked. Professional opinion from someone who's known her longer than I have. Tessa set down her fork and gave me that look again, the one that felt like being x-rayed by someone who actually knew how to read the results. Honestly, I think Riley's going through some kind of quarter-life crisis disguised as a relationship issue. She's 30, married, stable job, nice apartment, all the things she thought she wanted. But now she's wondering if this is all there is. And instead of dealing with that like a grown-up, she's decided to blow things up and see what happens. And her ex is what, exactly? The road not taken. More like the road she took and decided wasn't good enough the first time around, Tessa said. But memory's a hell of a drug. It edits out all the reasons you broke up with someone and leaves you with this highlight reel of the good parts. We spent the next hour talking about everything from Riley's tendency to romanticize the past to the general weirdness of modern relationships, where people somehow think they can have their cake, eat it too, and then complain that the bakery should have offered more flavors. Tessa had this theory that social media had basically ruined everyone's ability to be satisfied with normal human happiness, because there was always someone online living a more Instagram-worthy version of your life. The thing is, she said, gesturing with her wine glass, Riley's not a bad person. She's just scared of being ordinary. And you, unfortunately, represent ordinary to her right now. Stable job, predictable schedule, the kind of guy who remembers to take out the trash without being asked. That's not exciting enough for someone who's convinced herself she deserves fireworks every day. And what do you think I deserve? I asked. Someone who appreciates stability instead of taking it for granted, she said without hesitation. Someone who understands that fireworks are great for the 4th of July, but they're a terrible foundation for a relationship. When the check came, we split it without any weird awkwardness about who was paying, which somehow felt more intimate than if I'd tried to be chivalrous about the whole thing. We walked to the subway station together, and I found myself thinking that this was what adult conversation was supposed to feel like. Honest, direct, without all the emotional landmines that had become standard in my conversations with Riley. The platform. Tessa turned to me with something that might have been sympathy in her expression. For what it's worth, she said, I don't think this is really about her ex. I think it's about her trying to prove to herself that she's still the kind of person who can make dramatic choices. The problem is, she's making those choices at your expense. So what do? You keep being exactly who you are, she said. Don't apologize for being stable. Don't apologize for having boundaries. And don't let anyone convince you that being reliable is the same as being boring. When I got home, Riley was waiting with that same judicial expression she'd worn the night before. Except this time, there was an edge of something that looked suspiciously like panic. Maybe she was starting to realize that her carefully constructed narrative about my behavior wasn't holding up under scrutiny from people who actually knew both of us. You're ruining my friendships, she said before I'd even gotten my jacket off. Your ultimatum did that. I replied, hanging my coat on the chair with deliberate calm. I'm only refusing to be the only one who bleeds. The silence that followed felt different than the previous night's cold anger. This felt more like the moment when someone realizes their brilliant plan has just backfired spectacularly, and they're not sure how to fix it without admitting they were wrong in the first place. I went to bed thinking about fireworks versus foundations, and wondering when my wife had decided that predictable love was something to escape from instead of something to build on. Sunday afternoon rolled around with the kind of deceptive calm you get right before a hurricane makes landfall. I was sitting on the couch, trying to pretend I was reading the news on my tablet, when really I was just staring at the same article about municipal budget allocations for the third time, when my phone rang with that special ringtone I'd assigned to Meredith, Riley's mother, which sounds suspiciously like the theme from Jaws because I have a sense of humor about these things. Meredith's got this way of calling that makes you feel like you're being summoned to the principal's office, even when you're a grown-ass man who pays his own mortgage and has never missed a credit card payment. She's one of those women who perfected the art of disappointed authority sometime in the 80s and has been wielding it like a precision instrument ever since. Think Martha Stewart, but with less prison time and more opinions about other people's life choices. Hello, Meredith, I said, because we'd never quite graduated to the casual mom thing, despite 3 years of marriage and countless family dinners where she'd analyzed my career prospects and found them moderately adequate. I'm disappointed, she said, skipping right past any normal greeting because apparently we were jumping straight into the deep end of family drama. Her voice had that crisp quality that suggested she'd been practicing this conversation, probably while doing whatever it is that mothers-in-law do on Sunday afternoons when they're not calling to lecture their daughters' husbands about their moral failings. In what, specifically? I asked, because I've learned that when dealing with Meredith, precision is your friend. Give her an inch of ambiguity and she'll turn it into a mile-long dissertation about character flaws you didn't even know you had. Riley is going through a difficult time right now, she said, settling into that tone she probably used when Riley was 16 and had come home past curfew with some story about studying at the library. She's fragile, and instead of being supportive, you're out gallivanting with her friends like some kind of revenge fantasy. Gallivanting. Jesus Christ. Like I'd been out there doing the tango in public squares instead of having civilized conversations over dinner and drinks. But this was classic Meredith. Take a situation, add a few loaded words, and suddenly you're the villain in someone else's soap opera. Be the bigger person, she continued, warming up to what was clearly going to be a lengthy speech about my various shortcomings as a husband. That's what marriage is about. Sacrifice, understanding, putting your partner's needs ahead of your own selfish impulses. I sat there for a second, just letting that sink in. Selfish impulses. Because apparently asking for the same courtesy your spouse demands for herself is now considered selfish. I wondered if Meredith had applied this same logic when her own husband, Riley's father, had decided that his midlife crisis required a 25-year-old secretary and a red convertible, but I figured that was probably not the time to bring up ancient family history. Is being bigger the same as having no boundaries? I asked, genuinely curious about how this was supposed to work in practice. Because I'm trying to understand the rules here, Meredith. Riley gives me an ultimatum about spending time with her ex, and I'm supposed to just... What exactly? Sit at home, knitting while she figures out if the grass is greener with someone else. There was this pause where I could practically hear her recalibrating her approach, probably realizing that the guilt trip wasn't landing quite the way she'd planned. Meredith's smart. She didn't get to be the queen bee of her social circle by being stupid, but she's also used to people folding under pressure, especially men who want to keep the peace with their wives' families. She didn't really mean spend time with her ex like that, she said, which was such obvious bullshit that I almost laughed out loud. She's just exploring her feelings. It's healthy to examine your past relationships so you can move forward with clarity. She said it exactly like that, Meredith. I need to spend time with my ex or the marriage is off. Those were her exact words. Would you like me to play you the recording? I wasn't actually recording conversations with my wife. I'm not that paranoid yet. But the threat seemed to shut down that particular line of revisionist history pretty effectively. You're being deliberately obtuse, she said, falling back on that classic move where people accuse you of misunderstanding when really they just don't like what you understood perfectly well. After I hung up, politely, because I'm not an animal, I sat there thinking about the weird psychology of families and how they work. Meredith wasn't really calling to defend Riley's right to hang out with her ex-boyfriend. She was calling because her daughter's marriage falling apart reflected poorly on her own parenting, and if she could just convince me to be more accommodating, maybe this whole mess would resolve itself without anyone having to admit that maybe, just maybe, Riley was handling this like a teenager instead of a grown woman. Monday morning brought its own special brand of surreal normalcy. I dragged myself to the office, went through the motions of caring about quarterly projections and client deliverables, and tried to pretend that my personal life hadn't turned into some kind of social experiment about the limits of marital flexibility. Around 11, Mr. Okafor stopped by my desk with that look supervisors get when they're trying to figure out if you're about to become a HR problem. You look tired but steady, he said, which was probably the most accurate assessment anyone had given me all week. Steady is good. Mr. Okafor is one of those guys who understands that personal drama and professional performance don't have to bleed into each other, as long as you can compartmentalize effectively. He's been married for 23 years, has 4 kids, and probably has his own opinions about what constitutes reasonable behavior in a marriage. But he's also smart enough to know that offering unsolicited advice to subordinates is a good way to end up in sensitivity training. Thanks, I said, because sometimes the best response is just acknowledgement. I'm working on maintaining that steady part. Good man, he said, and walked away, leaving me with the oddly comforting thought that at least someone in my life wasn't trying to convince me that black was white and up was down. That afternoon, I did something that probably sounds pathetic, but felt necessary. I sat down with a notebook and actually wrote out my thoughts about this whole situation, like some kind of middle-aged man keeping a diary. But sometimes you need to see your thoughts on paper to figure out what you actually think about them. Respect without reciprocity is self-erasure. I wrote, and then underlined self-erasure twice because it felt important. Because that's what everyone seemed to be asking me to do. Erase myself for the sake of keeping the peace. Pretend that my needs and boundaries didn't matter as long as Riley felt supported in whatever identity crisis she was working through. That I thought about Meredith's phone call and how it perfectly illustrated the double standard that seemed to be operating here. Riley gets to explore her feelings and examine her past relationships for the sake of personal growth. But if I want the same courtesy, suddenly I'm being selfish and vindictive. Riley gets to test the boundaries of our marriage, but I'm supposed to just sit there and take it because that's what good husbands do. That night, I realized that this whole week had been like looking into a mirror. It showed who talked about values and who actually had them. All these people calling to lecture me about marriage and sacrifice and being the bigger person, but none of them seemed particularly interested in asking whether Riley's behavior was reasonable or fair. They just wanted me to absorb the damage and move on, like a human shock absorber for someone else's emotional chaos. That I went to bed that night thinking about the difference between being loving and being a doormat, and wondering when those two things had gotten so confused in everyone else's minds. Tuesday morning came with that crisp fall air that makes you feel like maybe the world isn't completely insane, just temporarily confused. I had about 4 hours to kill before my coffee date with Noor, which gave me plenty of time to overthink what was rapidly becoming the weirdest week of my adult life. I spent most of the morning at work trying to focus on spreadsheets and client calls, but my brain kept drifting to this conversation I was about to have with someone who'd known Riley since they were kids and probably had opinions about our marriage that she'd never shared with me directly. Noor had picked the grind, this bright little cafe near the Natural History Museum that looked like it had been designed by someone who really loved both coffee and succulents. The walls were covered with plants that probably had names I couldn't pronounce, and the lighting was that perfect combination of natural and artificial that makes everyone look like they're starring in their own indie film about urban 20-somethings finding themselves through caffeine consumption. That I got there about 10 minutes early, which is my usual strategy for conversations that might go sideways. Better to be sitting down with a drink in hand when the emotional bombs start dropping. I ordered something called a cours de deux because the barista looked like she'd judge me if I just asked for regular coffee, and found a table by the window where I could watch normal people living their normal lives while I waited to discuss the spectacular implosion of my marriage with my wife's most brutally honest friend. Noor showed up exactly on time, because she's the type of person who considers punctuality a basic life skill rather than an optional courtesy. She was wearing a denim jacket that looked like it had survived several decades and multiple fashion cycles, and she had that expression that people get when they're about to tell you something you probably don't want to hear, but definitely need to know. "Okay," she said, settling into the chair across from me without any of the social pleasantries that most people use to ease into difficult conversations. "I'm here because I care about you and Riley, but I won't enable foolishness, and what's happening right now is premium-grade foolishness." This was exactly what I'd expected from Noor, and exactly what I needed. No dancing around the subject, no trying to protect anyone's feelings, just straight-up honesty delivered with the efficiency of someone who'd probably been watching this train wreck build up speed for longer than I realized. "Tell me something I don't know," I said, taking a sip of my cours de deux, which turned out to be surprisingly good for something with a pretentious name. "Riley's got a pattern," Noor said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup like she was warming up for a long conversation. "When she gets stressed, when life feels too stable or predictable, she chases validation like it's going to plug whatever hole she thinks she has in her soul. And right now, she's convinced herself that time with her ex will confirm she's still desirable, still interesting, still the kind of person who has options." This lined up with what Tessa had said about Riley's quarter-life crisis, but hearing it from someone who'd known her since they were both wearing braces and worrying about algebra tests gave it a different weight. Noor wasn't analyzing Riley from the outside. She was speaking from 2 decades of friendship and probably more late-night phone calls about relationship drama than I wanted to think about. "But here's the thing," Noor continued. she's going to come home emptier than when she left. Because nostalgia is like junk food for your emotions. It tastes good going down, but it doesn't actually nourish anything. And her ex? He's probably just as confused about what he wants as she is. So what am I supposed to do with that information? I asked, genuinely curious about whether this was leading toward advice or just observation. You keep being exactly who you are, she said, which seemed to be the consensus among Riley's friends, assuming they weren't all just telling me what they thought I wanted to hear. Don't apologize for having boundaries. Don't apologize for refusing to play games. And definitely don't apologize for treating this situation like the two-way street it actually is. We spent the next hour talking about Riley's history of relationship drama, and I started to see a pattern that probably should have been obvious earlier. There was the college boyfriend she'd cheated on because she needed to know if she was missing something. The guy after graduation she'd broken up with because he was too available, and she needed someone who would challenge her more. The pattern seemed to be that whenever Riley felt secure in a relationship, she found a way to create chaos just to feel like she was still in control of her own story. The irony, Noor said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully, is that you're probably the most emotionally stable person she's ever dated, which is exactly what she said she wanted after all the drama with her exes. But now that she has it, she's bored. She wants the security of a stable relationship and the excitement of uncertainty, and she hasn't figured out that you can't have both. And what about you? I asked. How does this affect your friendship with her? Noor gave me this look that was part affection and part exasperation, like a parent watching their kid make the same mistake for the 10th time. I love Riley, but I'm not going to co-sign her bullshit. I told her last week that giving you an ultimatum was manipulative and stupid, and if she wanted to explore whether she'd made the right choice marrying you, there were better ways to do it than threatening to blow up your marriage. What did she say to that? She said I didn't understand because I've never been married. Noor laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Like being single automatically disqualifies me from recognizing emotional manipulation when I see it. As our conversation wound down, we established what felt like a mutual understanding. We both cared about Riley, but we also weren't going to pretend that concern justified enabling her to treat me like emotional furniture she could rearrange whenever she got bored with the current setup. Noor made it clear that she wasn't interested in being used as ammunition in whatever psychological warfare Riley might try to wage, and I respected the hell out of that boundary. For what it's worth, she said as we got ready to leave, I think you're handling this better than most people would. A lot of guys would either turn into controlling assholes or complete doormats. You're just being reasonable, which is apparently revolutionary behavior in this situation. On the train ride home, I found myself thinking about patterns and cycles, about how people can spend years talking about wanting stability and then sabotage at the moment they get it. I thought about the difference between love and validation, and whether it was possible to build a life with someone who confused the two. But mostly, I thought about what Noor had said about Riley coming home emptier than when she left, and whether that emptiness was something I could help fill or just something I'd have to watch from the sidelines. That I typed a single line in my notes app. I will not live on a leash someone else can lengthen any time they feel bored. Then I put my phone away and watched the city scroll past the train windows, thinking about freedom and what it actually costs. Tuesday night felt like the end of something, though I wasn't entirely sure what. Maybe it was the end of pretending this whole situation was sustainable, or maybe it was just the end of my patience with everyone treating my marriage like some kind of social experiment where only Riley got to change the variables. Either way, when I walked into our apartment after my coffee with Noor, I knew it was time to stop dancing around the elephant in the room and actually have the conversation we'd been avoiding since this whole mess started. Riley was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone with that particular brand of aggressive casualness that people use when they're trying really hard to look like they're not waiting for you to come home so they can have a fight. She looked up when I walked in, and I could see her scanning my face for evidence of whatever she thought had happened during my afternoon with Noor. It was becoming a pattern, this forensic analysis of my expression every time I came back from spending time with one of her friends, like she was looking for proof of some crime I hadn't actually committed. How was coffee? She asked, in that tone people use when they're asking one question but really want the answer to about 15 others. Enlightening, I said, hanging my jacket on the chair and settling into the space next to her on the couch. We need to talk. Something shifted in her expression then, like she'd been expecting this moment but hoping it would never actually arrive. She set her phone down on the coffee table with the careful precision of someone who's trying to control every variable in a situation that's rapidly spinning out of control. "Okay," she said, and I could hear the wariness in her voice. "Talk." I took a breath and tried to organize the thoughts that had been bouncing around in my head for the past 4 days. This felt like one of those conversations where the words you choose matter, where you only get one shot to say what you actually mean before everything gets filtered through hurt feelings and defensive reactions and all the other noise that makes real communication impossible. "I want us to sit on the floor," I said, which probably sounded weird, but something about being on the same level felt important. "No phones, no distractions. Just us." Riley looked at me like I'd suggested we conduct the conversation in interpretive dance, but she followed my lead, settling cross-legged on the living room rug like we were about to have some kind of meditation session instead of what was probably going to be the most important conversation of our marriage. "Here's the thing," I started, looking directly at her because this felt like the kind of moment where eye contact mattered. "You asked for time with your ex, or the marriage is off. I accepted. I matched the rules. And now I'm ending the freedom on my side. And I'm ending the marriage plan too." Her eyes went wide, like someone had just told her there was a pop quiz she hadn't studied for. "What do you mean, ending the marriage plan?" "I mean I'm calling off the wedding," I said, and the words felt both heavy and strangely liberating. "I'm canceling vendors, splitting deposits, returning gifts. All of it." The silence that followed was the kind that feels loud, like the moment right after a thunderclap when your ears are still ringing. I watched Riley process what I'd just said, saw her expression cycle through confusion, then panic, then something that looked like anger trying to disguise itself as hurt. "You can't be serious," she said, but her voice had gone up an octave, which meant she absolutely knew I was serious. "Dead serious. You gave me an ultimatum about spending time with another man or ending our marriage. I accepted both parts of that deal. You want to explore whether you made the right choice with me? Fine. But you don't get to do that while I'm planning our wedding and pretending everything's normal." Tears started then, which I'd been expecting. Riley's got this way of crying that's both genuine and strategic, real emotion that she's learned to weaponize when other tactics aren't working. But I'd had 4 days to think about this, for days of conversations with her friends who all seemed to understand what she was doing even if they weren't willing to call it manipulation to her face. "I didn't think you'd actually go out with them," she said, like this was somehow my fault for taking her words at face value. "And I didn't think you'd actually give me an ultimatum about your ex," I replied. "But your statement wasn't a question, Riley. You didn't ask for my thoughts or my feelings or whether there might be other ways to work through whatever crisis you're having. You told me what you needed and what would happen if you didn't get it. But I didn't mean, you meant exactly what you said. And now you're dealing with the consequences of saying it." The negotiation phase kicked in then, which is what always happens when people realize their bluff has been called and they're suddenly holding a losing hand. Riley tried tears, then anger, then bargaining, then back to tears, cycling through emotional strategies like someone channel surfing for a show that might hold their attention. "Can't we just pretend this didn't happen?" she asked finally, her voice small and desperate. "Can't we just go back to how things were?" And that's when I realized we'd hit the core of the problem. Riley wanted the ability to detonate our relationship and then act like the explosion never happened. She wanted to test our boundaries without any actual consequences, to see how far she could push before something broke, and then rewind the tape when she didn't like the results. "Pretending is how small lies become big life," I said, which sounded like something I'd read in a self-help book but felt true enough in the moment. "I'm done pretending that ultimatums are normal marriage communication. I'm done pretending that threatening to leave your spouse is an acceptable way to get what you want." Right in the middle of this conversation, Mrs. Adeyemi from next door knocked gently on our door. She's this sweet older woman who probably heard our raised voices through the thin walls and wanted to make sure nobody was bleeding. Even whispered pain leaks through apartment walls in this city, and our marriage's death rattle was apparently loud enough to warrant a wellness check. "Everything okay in there?" she called softly, and I could hear the genuine concern in her voice. "We're fine, Mrs. Adeyemi," I called back, though fine was probably not the word most people would use to describe a couple having a conversation about canceling their wedding on their living room floor. Just talking. When I heard her footsteps retreat, I turned back to Riley, who was looking at me like she was seeing me for the first time. Maybe she was. Maybe for 3 years, she'd been married to some version of me that existed only in her head. More pliable, more willing to absorb damage for the sake of keeping the peace. Trust is the house, I said quietly. Your ultimatum was the fire. She stayed quiet for a long time after that, just sitting there on the rug with tears running down her face, probably realizing that actions have consequences even when you really don't want them to. I felt sorry for her, in a way. Sorry that she'd convinced herself that love meant having the freedom to hurt someone without them fighting back. Sorry that she'd mistaken my stability for weakness and my kindness for stupidity. But I also felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Relief that I'd finally said what needed to be said, that I'd finally drawn a line that actually meant something. Relief that I was choosing self-respect over the illusion of harmony. So what happens now, she asked. Now we figure out how to untangle 3 years of shared life, I said. And you figure out what you actually want instead of what you think you should want. I went to bed that night in the guest room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the difference between love and hostage-taking, and whether it was possible to save a marriage from someone who seemed determined to destroy it. Wednesday morning felt like the first day of a new job, one I'd never applied for and definitely didn't want, but here I was anyway, about to become an expert in the fine art of dismantling a life I'd spent 3 years building. I woke up in the guest room with that groggy disorientation you get when your brain needs a few seconds to remember why everything feels wrong. And then it all came flooding back. The conversation, the decision, the look on Riley's face when she realized I actually meant what I'd said. The first order of business was coffee, because you can't effectively destroy your own wedding plans without adequate caffeine. Riley was already in the kitchen when I stumbled out, standing at the counter with her laptop open, and that expression people get when they're trying to solve a math problem that keeps changing every time they look at it. She'd obviously been up for a while, probably doing that thing where you lie in bed at 4 a.m. running through every possible scenario and hoping one of them doesn't end with your life completely imploding. I started a list, she said without looking up, which was probably the most practical thing either of us had said since this whole mess began. Vendors, deposits, that kind of thing. I poured myself coffee and looked over her shoulder at the spreadsheet she'd created, which was color-coded and alphabetized because even in crisis, Riley's the type of person who organizes her emotional breakdowns. She'd listed everything from the photographer to the florist to the string quartet we'd hired for the ceremony, complete with deposit amounts and cancellation policies that I'd never bothered to read, because who plans for their wedding to implode 6 weeks before the date? Bianca sent this yesterday, Riley said, turning the laptop toward me. She needs to know about final head counts and the cake tasting we're supposed to do Friday. Bianca's email looked like a medical bill for a body we couldn't save, line items for services that would never be rendered, deposits for a future that was evaporating in real time. The subject line read, "Final details, so excited," with enough exclamation points to power a small city, which would have been funny if it wasn't so depressing. I'll call her, I said, because someone had to be the adult here, and apparently that someone was going to be me. The conversation with Bianca was exactly as uncomfortable as you'd expect. She went through the 5 stages of grief in about 90 seconds. Denial. Are you sure you can't work this out? Anger. Do you have any idea how much work I've put into this? Bargaining. What if we just postponed for a few months? Depression. This is such a shame. You two seemed so happy. And finally, acceptance. I'll send you the cancellation paperwork. These things happen more than you'd think, she said at the end, which was either meant to be comforting or was just her way of processing the fact that she'd spent 6 months planning a party that was never going to happen. I had a couple last year who called it off because they couldn't agree on whether to serve fish or chicken. At least you have better reasons. Better reasons. Right. Because my wife gave me an ultimatum about spending time with her ex was somehow more dignified than arguing about wedding entrees. But I guess in the grand scheme of relationship failures, fundamental incompatibility about the nature of marriage probably does rank higher than disagreements about catering. The next week turned into a masterclass in the logistics of heartbreak. Canceling a wedding, it turns out, is like running a small business into the ground. There are contracts to break, deposits to forfeit, and a surprising amount of paperwork involved in officially declaring that your happily ever after is off the table. Some vendors were understanding, others were pissed, and a few tried to guilt-trip me into keeping my bookings because apparently my personal drama was interfering with their quarterly revenue projections. Riley handled her half of the cancellations with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else, checking items off our shared spreadsheet like we were planning a move instead of dismantling our entire future. We developed this weird efficiency around the whole process, dividing tasks, coordinating phone calls, splitting costs without drama. It was probably the most functional we'd been as a couple in months, which felt like cosmic irony at its finest. The photographer wants to keep the engagement session deposit, Riley said Thursday evening, reading from an email on her phone. But she'll release the wedding day payment since we're canceling with more than 30 days' notice. That's fair, I said, updating our shared document with the new information. At least we got some decent pictures out of it. Those engagement photos were sitting in a folder on our computer somewhere. 47 images of us looking happy and in love and completely unaware that our relationship was heading toward this exact moment. I wondered what we'd do with them now. Keep them as evidence of better times, or delete them like digital exorcism. The gifts were their own special category of awkward. 3 years of engagement had resulted in a steady stream of wedding presents from friends and family who'd apparently been more optimistic about our future than we were. Returning them felt like admitting failure to everyone we knew, but keeping them felt like some kind of emotional fraud. Your aunt sent back the salad bowl set, Riley said, opening a package that had arrived that morning. With a note. The note was exactly what you'd expect from my father's sister, brief, disapproving, and heavy on the implications about personal responsibility. Perhaps you'll have better luck with the next one, she'd written, which was either optimistic or just passive-aggressive, depending on how you wanted to read it. Friday afternoon, Riley tried one more negotiation session at our front door, catching me as I was leaving for what had become my daily run, a new habit that started as stress relief and turned into the only hour of the day when my brain could actually quiet down. "Can't we just pretend this didn't happen?" she asked, her voice small and desperate in a way that reminded me of the person I'd fallen in love with 3 years ago. "Can't we just go back to how things were before all this started?" And that's when I realized we'd reached the fundamental disconnect that probably should have been obvious from the beginning. Riley wanted the ability to unsay things, to take back actions, to rewind time to before she decided our marriage needed testing. But words have weight, and actions have consequences, and some things can't be undone just because you don't like how they turned out. Pretending is how small lies become big life, I said, which was becoming my unofficial motto for this whole experience. I stopped arguing with reality. That weekend, I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment across town. Nothing fancy. Just a place with good light and enough space for me to figure out who I was when I wasn't half of a couple. The moving process was surprisingly painless, probably because I'd been emotionally checking out of our shared space for weeks without realizing it. Marco, my spotting partner at the gym, helped me carry boxes and offered the kind of practical support that men excel at, showing up, doing the work, not asking too many questions about feelings. "You're breathing deeper," he said as we loaded my desk into his truck. I stopped arguing with reality. I told him, which seemed to make sense to him in a way that it probably wouldn't to most people, that my mom came by that first evening in my new place, bringing homemade jollof rice and the kind of maternal presence that doesn't require explanation or justification. She sat on my secondhand couch, the only furniture I had besides a bed and a folding table, and we ate dinner mostly in silence, which was exactly what I needed. "You did the right thing," she said finally, as we were cleaning up the dishes. "Did I?" "You stopped letting someone else define the terms of your own life," she said. "That's always the right thing, even when it's hard." That night, I lay in my new bed in my new apartment, listening to different traffic patterns and different neighbor sounds, and felt something I hadn't expected: peace. Not happiness exactly, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd finally stopped trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. A month later, I was sitting in my new apartment on a Saturday morning, drinking coffee from a mug that actually belonged to me instead of being part of some joint household inventory, when I realized something profound. I hadn't checked my phone for relationship drama in about 2 weeks. That might not sound like much to normal people, but for someone who'd spent the better part of a year walking on eggshells and monitoring the emotional weather patterns of his marriage, it felt like a minor miracle. The stories that had been flying around our social circle for the past few weeks were exactly what you'd expect when a couple implodes in semi-public fashion. Riley's version of events, as reported by various mutual friends who felt compelled to share their intelligence with me, painted me as cold, manipulative, and cruel. The kind of husband who'd rather destroy his marriage than work through problems like a mature adult. According to her narrative, I'd weaponized her friends against her and turned a simple request for emotional space into some kind of psychological warfare campaign. It was actually kind of impressive, in a twisted way, how she'd managed to reframe giving me an ultimatum about spending time with her ex as her being vulnerable and me being vindictive. The story had evolved through multiple retellings until it bore only passing resemblance to what had actually happened, like a game of telephone played by people who'd already decided who the villain was supposed to be. But here's the thing about truth. It doesn't actually require a public relations campaign. The people who were actually in the room during the key moments, who'd heard the actual conversations and witnessed the actual behavior, knew the timeline and the terms. Amara, Tessa, Noor, Kaido, my mother. They'd all been present for various pieces of this puzzle, and their version of events aligned with reality in a way that Riley's increasingly elaborate revisionist history didn't. That I wasn't dating anyone, which seemed to disappoint people who were expecting me to immediately rebound into some dramatic romantic storyline. The truth was, I was enjoying the radical concept of not having to negotiate the basic terms of my existence with someone who kept changing the rules. I ran at sunrise, cooked dinner for one, read books without someone asking me what I was thinking about every 5 minutes, and slept through the night without someone tossing and turning next to me while composing mental lists of everything wrong with our relationship. The running had become something more than stress relief. It was my daily reminder that forward motion was possible, that you could cover actual ground instead of just running in place while someone else changed the destination. I'd started with barely making it around the block without wheezing like a chain smoker, but by the end of that first month, I was doing 5-mile loops through the park and actually enjoying the rhythm of it, the way your mind clears when your body finds its pace. Cooking for one turned out to be its own kind of meditation. No negotiating what to eat, no accommodating dietary restrictions that changed based on whatever wellness trend Riley was following that week, no pretending to enjoy quinoa salads that tasted like disappointment. Just me, simple ingredients, and the satisfaction of making something good without having to justify my choices to anyone else. One evening, while I was plating homemade pasta and actually taking time to make it look nice instead of just shoveling food into my face while scrolling through my phone, Noor texted me a photo of a sunset from wherever she was that week. Some business trip to Portland or Seattle, one of those Pacific Northwest cities where everyone's aggressively outdoorsy and the coffee shops outnumber the residents. "You okay?" she wrote, which was both a genuine check-in and probably her way of seeing if I was ready to talk about what had happened without immediately turning it into some kind of therapy session. "I'm not performing okay anymore," I wrote back. "I am okay." And that felt like the most honest thing I'd said in months. Because there's a difference between being okay and performing okay for other people's comfort, between genuine peace and the kind of forced positivity that's really just denial wearing a happy face. I'd spent years of my marriage performing emotional stability for Riley's benefit, pretending that her chaos was normal and manageable, that ultimatums were just another form of communication in healthy relationships. The simple rule I'd learned was this: love cannot survive inside ultimatums, and marriage cannot begin with threats. You can't build something lasting on a foundation of conditional affection, where someone's love for you depends on your willingness to accept whatever terms they decide to impose. Real love, the kind that actually works long-term, requires mutual respect, consistent boundaries, and the understanding that partnership means working together towards shared goals, not one person constantly testing whether the other will break. That I thought about Riley sometimes, usually late at night when the apartment was quiet and my mind wandered toward what-if scenarios and alternate endings. I wondered if she'd figured out what she was actually looking for, or if she was still chasing validation like it could fill whatever emptiness had convinced her that our marriage wasn't enough. I hoped she was happy, in the way you hope for someone you used to love but couldn't save from themselves. The weird thing about the whole experience was how much it had taught me about my own boundaries, about the difference between being accommodating and being a pushover. For years, I prided myself on being the kind of partner who didn't create drama, who could roll with whatever chaos life threw at us. But there's a point where flexibility becomes self-erasure, where being understanding means accepting treatment that no reasonable person should have to accept. Marco had noticed the change during one of our gym sessions, commenting that I seemed lighter somehow, less like I was carrying invisible weight around with me everywhere I went. "You're moving different," he said while spotting me on bench press. "More confident, I guess." "I stopped trying to control things I can't control," I told him, which was another way of saying I'd finally learned the difference between working on problems and enabling someone else's refusal to work on themselves. My mom called every Sunday, not to check up on me, but just to maintain the connection, the way she'd always done even when I was married and presumably had someone else to talk to about life's daily nonsense. We'd talk about her garden, my work, the neighbors' various dramas, the kind of comfortable conversation that doesn't require emotional labor or careful navigation around sensitive topics. "You sound like yourself again," she said one Sunday, which made me realize I hadn't sounded like myself for a long time. That's good. That's how it should be. As winter started creeping into fall, I found myself thinking less about what I'd lost and more about what I'd gained. Freedom felt nothing like the flaunting, dramatic version I'd expected. It felt like breathing without asking permission, like making decisions based on what actually made sense instead of what might avoid conflict, like going to bed at night without wondering what fresh crisis tomorrow might bring. I turned off my phone during dinner now, not because I was trying to prove some point about mindful living, but because I wanted to taste my food and think my thoughts without the constant buzz of other people's emergencies and opinions. I ate slowly, cleaned my kitchen afterward, and felt grateful for the simple pleasure of a life that belonged entirely to me.